الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيبي إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. Can everyone hear me? Reciting salawat ala Muhammad wa ali. And please reduce the echo so there's no echo of that song.
No, the echo is down.
No echo, good. Alright, one more salawat ala Muhammad wa ali. During these days of Muharram that we are commemorating Imam Hussein alayhi salam, I have chosen this topic to look at Allah and try to increase our understanding of Allah. The title of this series is toward knowing God. Yesterday I tried to drive home the point that this is a worthy discussion, that it's something we need to engage in, that we need to think more about, and if we don't, we are doing a great injustice, and Allah is really everything, and we need to put a lot more effort in knowing Him and understanding who He is, what our relationship is to Him. And that is really the key to everything that we expect out of life. Our Iman is contingent upon our understanding of who Allah is, in whom we have Iman. If I don't know the one I believe in well, then my belief is a factor of that shallow knowledge. And if I expect to have Iman at the higher levels or highest levels, inshallah, then I need to have the knowledge that goes with that. Islam doesn't call on us to have a leap of faith. Islam is not a religion, and none of the religions of Allah are the religions where they say, you don't understand, believe anyway. It doesn't make any sense, don't worry about understanding, just believe in it. There are religions that say that. Right? Ask a Trinitarian Christian to explain the Trinity to you. They'll go around in circles, they'll be able to give some talking points that they've kind of come up with to try to understand how 1 can be 3 and 3 can be 1. But it makes absolutely no sense. And they themselves will say, it doesn't make sense, it's illogical. Definitely 1 does not equal 3 and 3 does not equal 1. The only problem is, logic is the problem. It doesn't make sense, that doesn't mean it's not true. In fact, because it doesn't make sense, it's true. They'll say things like this. And God is beyond logic. Our mind, the logic is the language of our mind. God is beyond that, so we can't understand Him. So if 1 equals 3 in His realm, that's nothing to, we have to believe it, we have to accept it. And that kind of talk is illogical, and Allah doesn't call on us to sacrifice logic, sacrifice knowledge, to give up knowing, and just believe in something, tie our hearts to something, even though it doesn't make any sense. That would be unjust of Him to do that. He's given us an intellect that can understand things, that can make sense of things. And that is the only tool we have to know. For Him to give us that tool, which is such a valuable tool, and they say, but don't use it. Not in faith anyway. You can use it for the dunya if you need to, but when it comes to your religion and your belief and in me, don't use your intellect. What kind of a God would set up a system like that? So Allah expects us to know first and then believe in what is true. That is extremely important. Because it is possible to believe in something despite the fact that I know it's false. That can happen. Belief and knowledge are two different things. I can know something's true, but then I don't believe it. I don't live by it. And I can believe that something's false and believe in it. A simple, mundane example is the doctor who knows for a fact the consequences of obesity or the consequences of smoking, He knows for a fact, what this action does to the body. And he tells his patients, you must not smoke, you must lose weight. But he himself is obese and smokes. His knowledge is there, but his belief is not there. He doesn't really believe in what he's talking about. Right? Fir'aun was in the same situation. وَجَحَدُوا بِهَا وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا أَنفُسُهُمْ ظُلْمًا وَعُلُوًّا tells us that he rejected Musa and said, what you're saying is, I don't accept it. Despite the fact that he had yaqeen, وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا comes from the same root as yaqeen. He had yaqeen that what Musa is saying is true. Fir'aun was not in doubt. He wasn't ignorant. His problem was not that he doesn't know, it hasn't made sense yet whether what Musa is saying is true or not. He's not convinced by the miracles. He's not sure if this is only God can produce this or magic can also produce something like this. He didn't have any doubts. He had certainty that what Moses is saying is absolutely true. That the God of Moses is the God, and he himself who says, Ana Rabbukum al-A'la, is no God at all. He knows all of that. Despite the fact that he knows with certainty, he rejects. Jahadu biha wastayqanatha. They rejected it despite the fact that they had yaqeen in the truth of what Moses was teaching. Alright, so knowledge and belief don't necessitate one another. Just because you know something doesn't mean you're going to believe in it. And just because you believe in something doesn't mean that you think it's true. People do that all the time. They believe in things. Sometimes belief now has become, especially in American culture currently, belief means I wish it were true. Despite the fact that there's no evidence to support it, I wish it were true. Right? If you look at how people use believe, they'll say, I believe that he's going to survive this bout of stage 4 cancer, for instance. I just believe that he's going to get through it. Despite the fact that the doctors say no, the human beings are going to die, the disease, the record of the disease is such that it's devastating to the human body. But I believe means I hope that despite all evidence, this thing will be true, this person will live. And that's not the way that Islam calls us to believe. We believe in what is true. How do we know what's true? Let's go back to the beginning. We have to know. So if I'm going to believe in Allah at those high levels of Iman, I need to know who God is. And that knowledge is something we have to work on. We have to struggle to gain. And not only, it's not just rote knowledge, I have to just learn lists or learn facts. I have to struggle with ideas and think about them and discuss them. And I'll have doubts, natural doubts that are a good place to start. Shaykh al-Lahiri has a phrase in one of his books. He says, doubts, shak, is a great place to start. It's a terrible place to remain. Right? Having doubts is not a bad thing. It's a part of the natural process of learning. You have a question. Someone says something that makes sense to them, but something doesn't make sense to me yet. So I have a question, I have a doubt. Is it true, is it not true? What about this, what about that? That's perfect. This should happen. If it doesn't happen, then there's something wrong with me. Either the knowledge was so straightforward and so simple that it just made total sense, that's possible too. But if it's something complicated, unless I'm extremely bright and I'm able to connect the dots immediately and understand exactly what the person's saying in all its detail right away, I'll have questions naturally. I'll have doubts. I'll have questions. And so I should pose those, discuss them, and work through those doubts to get to a place where now I have knowledge in the truth or the falsehood of whatever has been said. So doubts are fine, doubts are good, but they are a starting point, and they should become a springboard so that we launch ourselves into discussion, into research, into all those things that are going to lead to knowledge, and that knowledge then is the basis for our belief in Allah and all the other beliefs. But right now, we're speaking about the most essential of our beliefs, which is the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the discussion yesterday was about this question, why is it important for me to know God better? Today, what I want to spend our time discussing is the next step in this process is, how can I know God? What are the pathways that are open to me to know God? And how can I now achieve this knowledge that we've said is so important to achieve? I'll introduce that just as an idea, but what I want to focus on today is another question which is related, which is, how can't I know God? What are the ways that are closed to us? Right? This is a path that we have to engage and embark on to know Allah. There are certain ways that we can know God, and we'll discuss those, inshallah, tomorrow and the next day. But before we figure out how we can know God, it's also very important to know how we can't know God. What are the wrong ways that sometimes people think they can know that God exists, or that they can know what God's attributes are, but they're wrong ways. They're wrong questions to ask. They're irrelevant. They're unfounded. They have no connection to the reality of who Allah is. And people say there's no dumb question. There actually are dumb questions. A dumb question is a question that hasn't been thought out, where there's no thought that goes into formulating the question. That is a dumb question. When they say there's no dumb question, that means don't be scared to ask a good question. Don't think that asking a question and expressing your ignorance about something, your doubt about something, is somehow a mark, a blemish on your character. That's a mark of your curiosity and the power of your mind, that you want to understand, your desire to seek the truth, that you ask a question. So, but how is it? There are certain ways that you might think you can seek knowledge of Allah, but there are wrong ways. There are ways that are either dead ends, or there are actually some inabilities within us that prevent us from being able to use these pathways to know Allah. So I'm going to touch on 3 of these ways that are prevalent in ahadith, where people ask questions related to these 3 pathways, and the Imams shut the door and say, no, this is not a valid pathway, this is not a way to know Allah. The first way that we might think you can know something is a way that we know other things. Right? One of the primary ways that we know the world around us is through our senses. All right, our 5 senses are our windows to the outside world. And primary is our sight. Right? We see things, and we know that they exist. We see things, and we know qualities about them. I can see the color of your clothing. I can see the number of people sitting here. I can see the gender. I can see different qualities of all the people sitting here through my faculty of sight. And so I'm gaining knowledge by looking at you of certain details of the people who were gathered here. So sight is a natural pathway. It's a window between the external world and my mind. Similarly, our other senses, what I hear you saying is a valid way for me to learn certain things. If I hear someone in the next room, I don't see them, I don't know if they're there, but I hear them, so that the sound tells me something, that they're either there, or it's a recording of their voice, or the telephone is on speaker, but there's some actual presence of a voice, and I can know something about who it is and what they're saying through the faculty of sound. That's a valid window to the external world. Touch, that we don't use it so much in terms of when we're talking about these kinds of things, but that's also an important way that we know the world around us, through touch. And then taste and smell also. But primarily, when we're talking about learning, we usually think about the first 2, sight and hearing, as ways to know something. The problem comes with something that we talked about yesterday. There's a difference between the physical world, the material world, and the world that is beyond material. Okay, we call it metaphysical world, which is a big word that means it's what is beyond the physical. So our external senses, these 5 senses that we talk about, they are pathways for us to know the material world around us. I can use my eyes to see all of you because you all live in the same material world that I live in. But can I use the same sense of sight to see your spirit, for instance? I can't see your spirit. I can't see your ruh. Because it's a being that doesn't belong to the material realm. It's not located in a space. It doesn't have mass. It doesn't have volume. It's not located in a particular location. Right? When we say, for instance, our ruh is here in our heart or something like that, those are all just ways for us to think about something. but they don't have any reality. We can't point to our ruh and say our ruh resides here, resides there. I can't use my eyes to see the angels. And there are at least 4 times as many angels in this room as there are people sitting here. Right? We have the Kiram Katibin. Each of us has these 2 angels that are in charge of writing our deeds. And the Quran also tells us that each of us has 2 angels that are hafadha, that are guardian angels that protect us from the hardships that are unintended by God. The death that is unintended by God, they protect us from those things. Until finally our time for hardship or sickness or death comes, then they back away. And the next incoming missile of death or sickness strikes us and afflicts us. But they're guarding us constantly. So these 4 times as many angels as we are sitting here are here in this room with us. Allah's salam on them. And if we're doing the right thing, if we're commemorating this majlis in sincerity, then ahadith tell us that many more angels are here present with us. Despite the fact that they are present, and our texts tell us that they are present, we can't perceive them with our senses. I can only tell you with certainty that they're here because I believe in the Quran, and the Quran tells us that those 4 times the number of people here, angels, are here. So while sight is a way that we can know some things, we have to realize what are the limitations of that same sight, which is invaluable. It's limited. Its jurisdiction is the material world around us. And so if something is beyond the material, if it's in the metaphysical world, beyond the physical realm, it can exist, but I'm not able to see it. Alright, so if that's clear, then we should also translate this over to our knowledge of Allah. We can't expect that at any point in our existence that we would be able to use the faculty of vision to see Allah. And it's not only a limitation of this world. Even in the hereafter, there's no seeing God. There's no idea of ever seeing God with our sight. So we have many ahadith that speak to this, and I want to share some of these ahadith with you from the Ahlul Bayt. Before that, let me also share this story. So we have a story of Musa alayhi salam and his people, and they also make a demand, they want to see God. Right, so if you think back to the story of Musa alayhi salam, when he is traveling from Madian, when he's been with Shu'aib, he's married one of the daughters of Shu'aib, and now he's heading back towards Egypt. On his way back to Egypt, they run into some trouble, it becomes dark, and they don't have light, and he sees a light in the distance and tells his wife and children or whoever's with him, stay here, I'm going to go and see if I can get some fire from there and bring it back, and then we can see with that fire. And so he goes off, and we're told in ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt, very interestingly, that while if you look at the geography of Madian, which is in the vicinity of northwestern Arabia now, like near Tabuk, in that area, so that's where he's coming from. He's heading towards Egypt, which is basically due west. So he's in that trajectory, going west. So most people in the Judean and Christian tradition, and even in the non-Shi'i tradition, they think that Musa alayhi salam probably encountered Allah and embarked on this journey up the mountain and into the valley of Tuwa in the Sinai Peninsula. That's all it would say, Tur Sayna, Mount Sinai, and they'll identify certain mountains in that Sinai Peninsula region as the place where Musa spoke with Allah. In the ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt, every single hadith that we have about this says that it wasn't there. When he encountered Allah and spoke with Allah from that burning tree, it was actually Karbala or Najaf in some ahadith. That's where this encounter took place. Now, how he got there, it was miraculous that he was able to go from this place to that place within moments, because he left his wife on that pathway, because she didn't travel with him. He left his wife and his children and whoever was with them in that same place on that route from Madian to Egypt. But then as he travels, as he goes towards the light, Allah transports him to Karbala or Najaf, and that's where he encounters. That's Wadi Tuwa. That's this sacred valley where Musa is able to encounter Allah and speak with Allah. So he goes towards the fire, and he hears the voice of Allah saying, فَخْلَعْ نَعْلَيْكَ إِنَّكَ بِالْوَادِ الْمُقَدَّسِ طُوًى. Take off your shoes, remove your shoes, because you are now entering into this sacred valley of Tuwa. And he proceeds, and he sees that this fire is not just a campfire or something like that of some other travelers, but it's a fire that is emanating from an olive tree. And the Bible is referred to as a burning bush or a burning tree, if it's something bigger than a bush. But it's from this tree then that he hears this voice of Allah speaking, saying, إِنَّنِي أَنَا اللَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا أَنَا فَاعْبُدْنِي وَأَقِمِ الصَّلَاةَ لِذِكْرِي. I am your Lord, right? So worship me and establish prayer to remember me. So he sees something, he sees fire, he hears a voice that is created by Allah to speak to him and communicate to him, and he receives his mission that you have to return to Egypt, and you have these two missions. One is to free the Bani Israel, and one is to go and speak to Fir'aun and discuss with him, call on him to believe also. So he has these two missions then, and he goes on to Egypt, and the whole saga in Egypt takes place. After everything happens in Egypt, and they finally, on the Exodus, they exit Egypt, right? Fir'aun is killed, and now Moses and his right-hand successor Harun and their helpers U.S.A. and Caleb are with them. They travel around, and at one point they are guided, Allah guides them to back to the same place where He spoke to Moses in the first place. He says that I'm going to give you revelation. I'm going to give you a book that will be a source of guidance for your people. And so they are led back to the same place where he initially saw the flame. And there, not alone, not just with his family, but with perhaps hundreds of thousands, 600,000 according to some reports of the Bani Israel with him, they camp out at the base of this mountain, this valley. And Moses tells them that I will go up to the mountain as Allah has commanded me, and 30 days later I will return and I will have this revelation, inshallah, that Allah has promised us as a source of guidance. You all stay here. Harun is my vicegerent to take care of affairs. You answer to him, and he is in charge of your welfare and your well-being. The Bani Israel's response, they're excited, but they say, we want to see God. We want to hear His voice as you heard His voice. Moses insists that this is my task. I'm the prophet who has the capability to receive this revelation. This is not something that's a shared responsibility amongst us. They say, no, we're not going to believe in whatever book you bring down unless we hear God's voice the way you heard it. So after some struggle, Moses finally says, fine, I will take some of you with me. And so he chooses and he pares down the choice until he finally settles on 70 people that he takes up with him to the mountain. They travel up the mountain, and then he tells them we have to engage in ibadah for these 30 days. وَوَعَدْنَا مُوسَى 30 لَيْلَةً. Right? Allah promised him that you have these 30 days in which you have to prepare yourself to receive revelation. It's not just a message that comes very easily. It's a message that requires the capacity of a human soul to receive that message. Receive it into the heart, receive it into the spirit. It's not just words that you and I could also receive. I can give you a book and you now have the book. It's not something like that. Even the tablets that are being given to Musa is something he has to prepare himself for to be able to receive this revelation. And so for 30 days, he and those 70 companions, they prepare themselves, they fast during the days, they pray, they engage in all kinds of worship to prepare themselves for this. 30 days come, and the crescendo of their spirits is there, and Musa says, Allah has extended the 30 to 40 to 10 more days. وَأَتْمَمْنَاهَا بِعَشْرٍ. And we completed those 30 days with 40. Now the people at the base of the mountain are waiting at 30 days, they're waiting for Musa to come back down, they see he's not coming. They become angry. They feel like Moses, after all of our insistence that we hear the voice of God, he's run away. And all sorts of terrible things happen there. They fall into shirk and the tricks of Samiri, and even to the point where they threaten the life of Harun himself. On the mountain, it's similar. They also feel frustrated. Why 10 more days? Why did Allah change? What is this bada? What is this change in Allah's decree that has increased the 30 to 40? In any case, they extend their ibadah. They have Moses to explain it to them. They extend their ibadah for another 10 days. At the end of 10 days, they're prepared for reception of this revelation. Allah gives the tablets, the alwah, to Musa alayhi salam. And He speaks to him and gives him different instructions. And all of his 70 companions are there witnessing, not maybe seeing anything, but witnessing, able to hear some of what is being exchanged between Allah. Allah creates a voice that they can also hear. When it's done and they're ready to go back down, Moses says, your duty, O 70 people, is to testify, to bear witness to the rest of our people that you have witnessed me receive this revelation from Allah Himself. That was your job. They turn around and say, we're not going to do that unless we actually see God with our own eyes. Hearing Him was not enough. How do we know? Maybe it was another voice, a voice that you created or something like that. Until we see God as you saw Him clearly in the burning bush, we're not going to believe. Arina Allah Jahra. And show us Allah clearly right before our eyes. Moses is so frustrated. He says, you can't see Allah. Allah is not something that you can see. I didn't see Allah in the burning bush. Allah is not a burning bush. He's not a fire. That was just a symbol. He created that fire there just as a focal point for me to look at something. And He created a voice in that fire so that I could hear and I could communicate with Him. When Allah spoke to me, I wasn't hearing God's voice. Allah doesn't have a voice. He can create a voice, create a sound that He can communicate with us. Neither did I hear God's voice, nor did I see God. I was spoken to by God through these words, through the means of this burning bush. Min warai hijab, as the Quran mentions. They insist, they say, no, we're not going to testify unless you show us God. So Musa turns to Allah embarrassed at the fools that he's brought with him, and he says, Allah, on behalf of these foolish people that are here, I ask you, Arini anzur ilayk. Show me that I may see you clearly. Allah responds with the same answer Moses gave to his people, Lan tarani. You're never going to see me. But he says, Walakin anzur ila al-jabal. Look across the way at this mountain in the distance. انظر إلى الجبل فإن استقر مكانه فسوف تراني. I'll show myself, I'll expose myself, I'll give a glimpse of my existence to this mountain in its massiveness. If that mountain can bear to look at me, to witness my existence, then you have a chance. Then maybe you can also see me. فإن استقر مكانه فسوف تراني. If that impossible thing, which is this mountain withstanding the presence of Allah, if that happens, then maybe you have a chance to see me. فَلَمَّا تَجَلَّى رَبُّهُ لِلْجَبَلِ جَعَلَهُ دَكَّى. When Allah expresses Himself or shows Himself, that's tajalli, shows Himself in some way to that mountain, in all its massiveness, it explodes. And the mountain can't bear to witness Allah in that way. The companions of Moses are bewildered, and a moment later the shockwave of that mountain comes and kills all of them. All 70 of them are killed. Moses is also knocked unconscious. After a little while, فَلَمَّا أَفَاقَ, he comes to, he looks around at the scene, and his dua to Allah is أَتُهْلِكُنَا بِمَا فَعَلَ السُّفَهَاءُ مِنَّا. Are you going to destroy all of us because of these fools and what these fools have done? This kind of a question was an unwarranted question. It was a wrong way of trying to know you. They wanted to see you, and they wouldn't believe in you or know you until they saw you with their own eyes. They didn't realize that eyes are incapable of seeing you. This is not the right way to know God. So Allah revives those people. He brings them back to life so that makes Moses' job easier. He doesn't have to go back to his people who are already skeptical and now say, I have no witnesses, and in fact all the witnesses that you sent with me are all dead. So to ease Moses' way, he gives life to these people. They say they'll now testify to what they have seen, the revelation, and they return down from the mountain. So this is one story in the Quran that tells us many lessons, but one of the lessons is this idea that seeing God is impossible, and seeing God is not a valid way of knowing Allah. So I'll share a couple of ahadith with you as well from Al-Kafi, where the Imams tell us a similar story. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa This first hadith in Al-Kafi is a hadith with Imam Abu Ja'far al-Baqir alayhi salam. It tells us that a man from the Khawarij entered into his presence and asked him, "What do you worship?" The Imam said, "Of course, God Almighty." Then the man asks, "Have you seen him?" When you say you worship Allah, how do you know He exists? Have you seen Him with your own eyes that you know that He exists? The Imam responds first, yes, which would be a shock to the person. It's probably a shock to you as well. Why would he say yes? I just got done saying you can't see Allah. It's not just you and me who can't see Allah. Even the Imam, even the Prophet, no one can see Allah. It's impossible for a human being or any creature to see Allah. But the Imam says yes, but not as you may think. For eyes have never seen Him through the sight of seeing. Nonetheless, hearts have been able to see Him through the high stations of faith. This is a phrase that's repeated by different Imams. Even in Nahj al-Balagha, Imam Ali says a similar thing. In Arabic, Islam tarahu al-uyun bi mushahadat al-ibsar, walakin ra'athu al-qulub bi haqa'iq al-iman. So when I say I've seen Allah, what you're really asking is, do I know Him as though I've seen Him? Right? We say, there's a phrase, seeing is believing. That's not, again, the problems with that phrase, but that's the kind of mentality this person has. Have you seen Him, then you know that He exists and you believe in Him. And so the Imam says, yes, I have seen Him, not that I've seen Him with my eyes. Eyes can't see Him. But I have seen Him with my heart. بِحَقَائِقِ الْإِيمَانِ, with the high stations of faith, I have seen God, and I see God. He's a constant presence for me. Then you might think, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to see? Our heart is not a faculty of sight. We don't see with our heart. It's an expression of that certainty, that knowledge that comes, just as when I see you standing in front of me, I know that you are there. So the knowledge that comes with certainty from sight in the physical world, for things that are not physical, that are in the metaphysical world, the knowledge that comes, the certainty that comes in the existence and the attributes of those things is through the knowledge of the heart. That's where it starts. And then as the knowledge increases, then it's the belief in those things that the heart knows to be true. And so the heart can know Allah, and when it knows Allah, it is as though it is seeing Allah in His reality. It has absolute certainty that Allah is the truth. Allah is everything. Allah is the reality. So it's through that faculty of the heart that I see Allah, not through the faculty of my sight. He says He is not known through comparison, nor is He perceived through the senses. The senses are not able to perceive Allah because, as we mentioned, the senses are limited to the physical realm. And if Allah is definitely beyond the physical realm. Even these other things I mentioned, angels and the spirit, and these other things are also, heaven and hell, these are also beyond the physical. And we can't witness those with our eyes. Allah is the creator of all of this. He's also beyond the physical and the ultimate. And so, of course, the faculties that are limited to this world cannot in any way perceive Him. Another tradition says the following. This is a hadith attributed to the sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam. A companion of his says that I discussed what people were transmitting about the possibility of seeing God with Abu Abdullah al-Sadiq. In response, he said the following. So people were, this is a hot topic of that day, where people were talking about the possibility of seeing Allah. And they would sometimes cite certain verses that seem to be saying that something can be seen on the Day of Judgment. Right? There are ahadith that were narrated from other pathways, not the Ahlul Bayt, that also indicated that Allah could be seen. If not in the dunya, then on the hereafter, that certain people could see Him, for instance. And so these were things that were being discussed, and the Shia of the Imams also would be engaged in these discussions, and they would have to defend the correct position. Sometimes they would get confused by what was being said, and so they would bring this issue up with the Imam. This is what people are saying, what's the truth of the matter? So the Imam's line of reasoning is the following. He says the sun is 1 part in 70 of the light of the throne. So if you compare the brilliance of the sun that we can see, that's part of our physical world, he says that if you compare that to the brilliance of Allah's arsh, His throne, there's a minuscule ratio between this and that. He says 1 in 70. And the throne is 1 part in 70 of the light of the dais. If you compare the kursi to, if you compare the kursi to the arsh, it's the same relationship. The light of the kursi within the dais of Allah is like 1 to 70. The curtain is 1 part in 70 of the light of the veil. And he goes on and he mentions all these different aspects, these different creatures or these different entities that are in that kind of a realm that have different levels of brilliance, and each one is 70 times more brilliant than the one before. Then he says, so if they are correct, these people who claim that Allah can be seen, Allah who is certainly more brilliant than all of these things that He's created, His throne and the dais and the curtain and all these things, if they are truthful, if they're correct in their claim that God can be seen, let them stare wide-eyed at the sun before which there is no cloud. So you think you can use your eyes to see Allah, who is beyond the physical, whose brilliance is Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Right? Try your hand at the sun, which is a material creation, whose brightness is just a fraction of the brightness of all those other things. And if you can't even stare at the sun without burning your eyes, you can't even keep your eyes open with the sun, then how do you think that you'll be able to stare Allah in the face and witness His brilliance? Now, one question that this hadith raises is there's a disparity between the two lights. We're talking about the sun, which is a material light, is a physical light. All the other things that he mentions, that he compares the light of the sun to, are things that are beyond the physical. When he said Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth, we're not talking about a light that could be measured in lumens. There are photons coming out from Allah. It's a light, it's a figurative light, it's a light that we can't witness in the world. So he's not saying that the light of the throne and Allah Himself is something like the light of the sun, that is some physical light that's just too bright because our eyes are too weak, we can't see it. If only you had stronger eyes, we'd be able to see Allah. No, that's not the reality. The reality is no matter how strong our eyes might be, how big our eyes might be, the reality is that we can't see Allah not because our eyes are weak only, but because they are bound to the physical world. And so Allah, which was beyond the physical world, He obviously can't be seen with this material and physical sense. So that's one of the faculties that we might think we can know Allah by. And in Islamic history especially, people have had this misconception. And sometimes verses of the Quran also seem to indicate things that make them think this. But this is a way that we obviously can't know Allah. Our sight is incapable of knowing God. What about our minds? What about our imagination? Can we imagine God with our mind? Because our mind is something that's much more flexible, much more plastic, that can understand things and know things even that we can't see. So our senses might be limited. I can only see what's in this room, but I can imagine what's in the room behind, even though I can't see it. Right? My mind can reach there, and I can think about different things and imagine what it might be like. If you describe it for me just in words and ideas, then my imagination becomes populated with all these real data points from the information I gather from you, without having had any sensory connection with the contents of that room. Just from the description that you give me and the ideas that come into my mind, I come up with this picture, this image, it could be very accurate based on how well you describe it and how well I perceive that description and how strong my imagination is. So our imagination is stronger than our sight. Can our imagination know God? Can we imagine Allah? and come up with an image in our mind of who Allah is. Let me share one hadith with you on this note as well, where the Imams speak about imagination, which is a translation of the word wahm. Recite salawat. One person comes to Imam Al-Jawad alayhi salam. He says, I asked Abu Ja'far about God, saying, may I imagine something when I want to think of God and His attributes? So again, it's natural for us to want to do this. How can I worship God without picturing something? When I'm talking about Allah right now, all of us have something in our mind. When we think about Allah, we can't have a blank slate and have no attributes and nothing associated with it. We have something in our mind when we think about Allah. The problem is, what kind of image do we have? Right, the caricature of a God figure in Western culture and American culture right now, an old man with a beard and these kinds of things. Obviously, that's a false image, a useless image to have in your mind for God. But even if you think about Allah with these magnificent attributes and this all-powerful being and all these different attributes that we know about Him, something comes into our mind. So this person wants to know, is that okay? What am I supposed to think about when I think about God? Can I imagine something and have some image in my mind when I think about Allah? Imam Jawad alayhi salam, he responds as follows. He says, yes, you may imagine something incomprehensible and limitless. Right? So again, he gives us quite a difficult task. He says, yes, imagine something, you have to. But what you imagine Allah to be itself has to be something that has these two attributes. One is that something incomprehensible. So you imagine something, and you imagine Allah is something that I can't imagine. He is beyond my imagination. Something is limitless. I can't imagine Allah, I mustn't imagine Allah with limitations. Say Allah is there, for instance, not here. Allah lives in the Kaaba, for instance, and not outside the Kaaba, or something like that. Or He sits on a throne, but He's not down, on some other part of creation. Okay? Thinking like that, and thinking Allah is limited to one place or another, or limited in His attributes. He has power to do something, but no power to do another thing. He has knowledge of something, but He doesn't have knowledge of something else. Those kinds of limitations that our mind puts on the image of who God is, those are not allowed. So as you think of Allah and picture who Allah is, make sure it's a picture that is recognizing the fact that whatever I think is something that's my own creation. It's not actually Allah. So whatever Allah actually is incomprehensible to me. That's the God I think of. Something I can't even imagine, that's the God I imagine. A God who is unimaginable. A God who is without limit. He says, nothing resembles Him, and thus the mind cannot behold Him. I can either see things directly and I have a picture in my mind, or I compare something to something. When you describe the contents of that room, then you say there's a chair there, and I can picture a chair here, so I say, well, maybe it's a chair like this. You say there's a carpet there, there's a carpet here, so I think, well, maybe the carpet that you're describing there must be like the carpet I can see here. Right? So I have experience with certain things that are in my mind, and then when I have to go to something beyond that in my imagination, I compare it to things I already know. And then I extend my knowns to the unknown to try to know what is unknown. With Allah, I can't do that. Right? Because He is beyond everything. He's limitless. So whatever I try to imagine, everything falls short of Him. Nothing resembles Him, and thus the mind cannot behold Him. How could the mind behold Him when He is other than anything that can be comprehended, and other than anything that can be imagined? Thus, one may only imagine something incomprehensible and limitless. When you think of Allah, think of the incomprehensible, something that's beyond your imagination. That's the kind of Allah that you can have in your mind. Not an Allah who is very easy to think about and has limits and looks like a person or has these different attributes that we associate with creatures and human beings and so forth. So even our imagination, which is a strong faculty, even that has no power to know Allah. One other limitation, so these two are limitations of our faculties. Right? Our faculties are incapable of knowing God in this way, at least these faculties, our sight and our imagination. The last point I want to share with you is that when we talk about Allah, there is something that's called the that of Allah, which is, say, the essence of Allah. And then we talk about His attributes, His qualities. Right? When we talk about His attributes, that's what we're going to get into, inshallah, in a few days. What are the attributes of Allah, and what is the nature of those attributes and so forth. But there is something called the essence of God, the actual existence of God. If you think about us, like, there is me, who I am, say it's my spirit, my mind. There's something essential to me. And then there are things that are non-essential to me, that are attributes that I have. Right? So the clothing I'm wearing, if I change my clothing, I'm still me. If I change my hair or my beard or external things, I'm still me. If I know something or I forget something, if I learn something, I'm still me. So my knowledge is something that's not essential to me. The me in me, that spirit, that essence of who I am is one thing. All these attributes are something external to that, extraneous to that, separate from my essence. So when we think about Allah, there's also something like this. That comparison, again, is problematic with Allah because there's no essence of God and then a separate attribute. We'll talk about that because that's a little bit complicated. That'll come in a couple of days, inshallah. But the essence of Allah is something that we are told not to think about, not to question, not to ask about. Why? Because we are incapable of knowing anything about Allah's essence. And if the more we ask, the more we try to think about His essence, the more actually, instead of getting closer to Allah or knowing Allah, the more we will become confused and have more and more questions and lose our way and lose our orientation completely because we have no answer and no even way to understand what Allah's essence is. So I'll share a couple of hadith with you about this and then we'll close, inshallah. Recite salawat ala Muhammad wa one more ala Muhammad wa So this is a pair of traditions that Shaykh Kulaini has brought together. The first says, تَكَلَّمُوا فِي خَلْقِ اللَّهِ وَلَا تَتَكَلَّمُوا فِي اللَّهِ. And talk about the creation of Allah, but don't talk about Allah Himself. Now that might seem a little bit difficult to swallow. Don't talk about Allah. Isn't that what we're supposed to be doing? Is that what we're doing right now? And the Quran is always talking about Allah. We're supposed to be talking about Allah. We have to learn about Him to know Him and then believe in Him. So how can we not talk about Him? So it doesn't mean don't talk about Him in particular. Shaykh Kulaini brings another tradition to explain what he's actually saying. تَكَلَّمُوا فِي كُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَلَا تَتَكَلَّمُوا فِي ذَاتِ اللَّهِ. And don't speak about the essence of God. And talk about Allah, His attributes. What are all those attributes that He has? How does He describe Himself? What are the attributes that we can see through the creation that He's created? When we see what He's done, then we can infer what the attributes are of the being who has done these things. Right? Again, to make a parallel with myself, there's one time when you know me directly. There's another time when you see something I've done. Right? If I've written something and you read that book that I've written, then through that book you start to understand something about who it is that made that book, who wrote that book. Right? If I cook some food and you taste that food, then you understand something through the action about the one who cooked it. If I give charity and you see that charity being given and the effects of it, then you know something about the one who gave that charity. Right? So with Allah also, everything is His creation. These are all reflections of who He is. And so as we reflect on creation and see, for instance, when we see the massiveness of creation, you look into the sky at night and you see stars, massive. The number of stars, the mass of those stars, the brilliance of those stars, the energy that's in those stars. When you think about that and think, well, Allah's the one who created all that, then how massive must Allah be that He has the power to make all of that? If that seems unfathomable, if that seems like I can't even imagine how that could happen, well, who's the creator of all of this? If it takes our most brilliant minds to try to uncover the mechanics of how things work, then what does that tell us about the one who created those things that are so intricate and so complex that even our most incredible minds, it takes them generations upon generations and all of humanity to uncover those secrets one by one. Right? We praise the scientists sometimes who discover these things. We forget to praise the one who created them in the first place. The scientist's knowledge and understanding is tiny, minuscule, compared to the knowledge and the wisdom and all that went into the creation of it in the first place. Right? So we're supposed to think about the creation of Allah, and through the creation of Allah we understand the attributes of Allah. We're supposed to think about the fact that Allah exists. We should know that for a fact. This concept of atheism and agnosticism and these things that eat away at our knowledge that God exists, and those are things we have to deal with, and sometimes we have to revisit why, or how do I even know that God exists? Sometimes people can be very convincing, and unless you are putting a lot of thought into it and really kind of going through their argument and staying strong in what you know, you can become fooled. And so thinking about these things, talking about these things, researching these things, asking the right questions about these aspects of Allah, of course this is very important, essential to our knowledge of God. But what we're not supposed to do is think about Allah's essence. Why? Because we have no faculty to understand what His essence is. It's infinite for one thing. So how do we even comprehend what's infinite? So a question like, for instance, where is God? How does He exist? When did He come into being? And these are all wrong questions. There are questions about His essence that are wrong questions, irrelevant questions. And if you try to understand what the answer is, then you'll end up with more and more confusion. Right? So some of the hadith, they say, if you engage in these kinds of questions, you'll increase, while you think that you're increasing in knowledge by asking questions and receiving answers, in reality, all you increase in is tahayyur. And tahayyur is confusion. Right? So the more you delve into this kind of a question, so the that of Allah is off limits. The essence of Allah. Other aspects of Allah, the fact that He exists, the fact that He's one, what His attributes are, those are all acceptable and necessary things to explore and understand. But the essence of Allah is something that we're not allowed to, and actually not even able to comprehend in the least. So these are three ways that we can't know God. One is our physical senses that are incapable of knowing God because He's beyond the physical. And one is our imagination, which is incapable of knowing God because our imagination is limited. Allah is unlimited, and so we can't imagine. If we can, whatever we do imagine has to be something with all those caveats. That is, we're imagining a being who is beyond imagination. And that's the kind of thing we can imagine, not anything more than that. And then we have no access to Allah's that because we have no faculties with which to even explore that. And it's not just because you and I are not infallibles. Even the prophets, even the angels, they have no access to this aspect of Allah, who He is, or what He is exactly, what His creation is like. How is it that He has knowledge, for instance? All right, for us, we have a whole field of philosophy, epistemology, that just explores how we know things. Or neuroscience talks about the physiology of how we come to know things, how our brain works, and how knowledge, for instance, comes into the human being, and what role it plays. How do we learn? With Allah, we can't ask these questions. How does Allah know? Where is His knowledge? What is the relationship between Allah's knowledge and Him? As soon as you start thinking about this, then you end up with more and more confusion. So there are certain aspects of Allah that are off limits to us. Alright, so now that we've explored how we can't know Allah, then we'll go forward, inshallah, from tomorrow and think of some of the ways that we can know Him. What are those pathways, and how can we benefit from them so that we can know Him better and, inshallah, become closer to Him and serve Him as we are destined to serve. Salawat ala Muhammad. We'll pick up the story of Imam Hussein alayhi salam in Medina. He was bidding farewell to his family in the night. He went to the Prophet's grave to bid farewell to Rasulullah and give his last ziyarah to Rasulullah, and he saw the dream that I mentioned yesterday. He visited Lady Fatima's grave. We don't know where that is. She was buried unknown to anyone in the darkness of night, but Imam Hussein was there, and so he knew where to go, and he spoke with her, and he visited her one last time. He visits the grave of his brother, Imam Hassan al-Mujtaba alayhi salam, and he bids farewell to all of them. Having gone to Baqi and visited all of these loved ones, he then goes to some of his family members and his trusted companions to ask their advice on what his course of action should be. One of the first people he goes to visit is his brother, his half-brother, Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya. His brother, who had been by his side, who had fought battles, who had been entrusted by Amir al-Mu'mineen. He asked Ibn al-Hanafiya what course of action he should take. Now this was a practice of Rasulullah to ask for mashwara, to seek the consultation of people. The reason for this consultation is very important because it's not that the Imam was confused or he didn't know what to do or he didn't have all the ideas in his mind and now he wants to go to Imam al-Hanafiya and gain some knowledge or gain some guidance that he didn't have access to. But the act of seeking counsel from somebody is very important in bringing that person on board and giving them agency so now they feel that they are part of your mission. They also had a say. Their voice was heard. You listened to what they had to say, you respected it, and then you incorporated it, or you rejected it, but you listened to it and you took the advice from them. And so he seeks counsel from Muhammad ibn Hanafiya. His brother's advice to him is that this is a very tricky situation that you are in, and it doesn't look like any good can come of it. We know what the people of Kufa are like. Yazid is making claims that he has no right to make. We know what kind of a person he is. He is someone completely unworthy of this position. People are going to be confused, as they always are. Instead of taking a stand, instead of taking some concrete action, he advises him to travel. Right? Hide yourself in this village and that village. Go onto the mountains, go and here and there, and just keep away from the limelight for some time until we see what people are going to do. Because while you have the right to khilafah, you have the right to imamah, people don't realize this. And it could be that people are fooled by Yazid as they are fooled by his father, and they will follow him. And it could be they rebel against him, and then this issue of you giving bay'ah or sacrificing your life by refusing the bay'ah is a moot point. So avoid the situation altogether at present and see what happens. And if you are forced to, he says go to Yemen. And Yemen is a place where you have supporters. Our father, Amir al-Mu'mineen, was a governor there, and the people love him. If you go to Yemen, the people will take you in and they will support you. So this is the advice that Muhammad al-Hanafiya gave to his brother Imam Hussein. And Imam Hussein appreciated the advice. He took it to heart. And then he deposits with Muhammad al-Hanafiya a wasiyah that declares what his mission is, why he is leaving Medina, and what his goal is in this departure. He says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Inni lam akhruj ashiran wala batiran wala mufsidan wala zalima. I am not rising up, I'm not leaving Medina for any personal gain out of arrogance, to cause trouble, to transgress anyone's right. وَإِنَّمَا خَرَجْتُ لِطَلَبِ الْإِصْلَاحِ فِي أُمَّةِ جَدِّي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ. My only purpose in leaving Medina is to bring reform to the ummah of my grandfather. أريد أن آمر بالمعروف وأنهى عن المنكر وأسير بسيرة جدي وأبي علي بن أبي طالب. My only goal is to enjoin good, forbid evil, and to travel in the footsteps of my grandfather and my father. He deposits this wasiyah with Muhammad al-Hanafiya before he leaves, so that no matter what happens, there's a record in history of the position of Imam Hussein, his pure intention, so that no one can twist it around and say that he left for personal gain or for power or to do this or to do that. The other person he visits before he leaves Medina is his grandmother, his step-grandmother, Salama. Salama, al-Mu'mineen, the wife of the Prophet. She had been like a mother figure to Imam Hussein, to the family of the Prophet, after Lady Khadija had passed away. And she had a deep love for all the members of the Ahlul Bayt. He goes to her and he tells her that he is going to leave Medina and he's going to travel to Mecca. She advises him against it. She says that all my life, your grandfather has told me stories about you. He has told me about your martyrdom. He has told me where it's going to happen, that it will happen in Iraq, in a place called Karbala. And I fear that the time has come for these prophecies to be fulfilled. She says that I remember now that Rasulullah gave me a vial filled with some sand. And she brings out the vial and shows it to Imam Hussein alayhi salam. The Imam miraculously produces a similar vial and says, I also have a vial. Maybe it was given to him by Rasulullah or he produced it himself. And he deposits this with Salama. And he says that it's true, the time for the fulfillment of these prophecies has come. When you look upon the sand, when you remember me, look upon the sand, and when you see that the sand is as it has always been, then know that I am well. But when the sand turns to blood, then know that I have been martyred. And all the prophecies of my grandfather have come to pass. And I have achieved that station which I could only achieve through martyrdom. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bibina alayka minni salamullahi abadan ma baqit wa baqiya al-layl wan-nahar ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. Allah, we ask you to shower your mercy and blessings on Muhammad and the family of Muhammad. Allah, we ask you to accept whatever commemoration we have had the tawfiq to perform. Accept what was said and what was heard. Help us to commemorate Imam Hussein with honor and dignity. And help this commemoration to lead to a strengthening of our faith, improvement in our character, so that we can follow the seerah of Hussein and the Ahlul Bayt. Alayhi salatu wassalam. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi.